Hey everybody, I am doing this. I'm hiding my face behind my mic because I think it's kind of funny, and also because I don't really have another way to set up my webcam such that my mic is picking up my voice and my camera's picking up my face, so we're just going to do it like this. Anyway, I read a whole bunch of books this year, and I wanted to talk about them, and I figured a fun way to talk about them would be to make a little list and rank them. This is mostly just an excuse to both give a little TLDR on my thoughts on every book I read this year, and also to, maybe give some recommendations to some people. And also, I just find it really fun to make ranking lists of things. It's a fun little mindless activity. And I guess just a few disclaimers, right? First, this is not an attempt to establish any sort of objective hierarchy, because I don't believe that such a thing is really possible. This is just purely my enjoyment, how much I felt like I got from each of these books. Secondly, I do believe that some of the books at the bottom of this list are genuinely bad, but for the most part, I tend to try to read books I think I'll enjoy. And I think this list reflects that. Even as we get into the 80s, there will be a few books that I didn't love, but I recognized some good things in the plot. I thought they were still solid overall, even if they had their problems. And once we hit the 50s, it's basically fantastic from there on up. And I'll also try to keep this whole video free of any major plot spoilers. There will be a few minor vibe spoilers, but we'll deal with those as they come. So let's start at the bottom with The Warded Man by Peter V. Brett. This was a book I was really looking forward to reading. I'd seen a lot of praise for it, so when I got to it, I was shocked to find a fantasy world with one central gimmick and no real distinguishing features outside of that. The characters were bland, the conflicts were black, white, and uninteresting, and the only distinguishing element of the copy-pasted fantasy villages each POV character starts in was the fact that, one mentor figure aside in each case, every other inhabitant sucks as a person. Grimdark fantasy fans rejoice, I guess, but for those who claim realism, everyone being an irredeemable shit is no more realistic than everyone getting along better than in a children's cartoon. You need a balance, and that book certainly lacked this. It really reached a point of absurdity, both in the narrator's insistence on emphasizing the people's many shortcomings and the form those shortcomings took. On top of all that, the prose was just mediocre, and what little plot there was barely had me interested at the best of times. There was also questionable handling of sexual violence that may have been handled better as the book went on. I did not stick around to see the resolution of that, but if it stuck with the way it was handled in the first, it certainly left a bad taste in my mouth. At number 110 is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which was, if anything, more disappointing to me than The Warded Man. I really looked forward to reading The Poppy War. I'd seen all this high praise for its characters and themes, and what I was led to believe was excellent prose, which, well, that impression didn't last long. The writing was clunky at the best of times, and only got worse when it came to dialogue, which was more wooden than... Anyway, ironically, the few attempts at humor fell flat the moment they felt the need to explain themselves, if not before. Similarly, its characters are simplistic, and each carried by a few quirky traits the narrator makes sure to point out rather than any deeper characterization. It's a sort of trick to make them memorable without putting in the work of making them interesting or good. The few exceptions to that rule, like the protagonist Rin, are undercut by this oddly shoehorned-in YA-esque romantic subtextual language and other strange inconsistencies with the book's overall tone. There's this moment where the main character, she's in the hospital, she's been seriously injured, and she sees this guy, and she just tucks her hair behind her ears. Oh my god. It's totally inconsistent with the vibe of the book. I'm not saying that people cannot fall in love during war. Obviously, that's not true. But the language, the subtextual language that is used to communicate that feels so out of place here. I also don't just see what people like about this book in general. If it's the parallels to real history in the plot, then what does the book do with those parallels that's interesting to you? What does it use them to say that isn't already said by the history itself? If it's the exploration of Rin's character, what her experiences lead her to do, then what in that exploration is interesting outside of the broad strokes? The characterization falls flat in the moment to moment. The narration robs the climax of its weight. I've also seen people call it important as a subversion of the expectations of the hero's journey, but it just isn't. It follows Campbell's structure about as closely, if not more closely, than any other contemporary fantasy novel, which is not to say that it fits perfectly. We're thankfully past the Star Wars era in that respect, but it certainly doesn't subvert it. It's people seem to think that it subverts the hero's journey, I think in part because of the moral ambiguity and even not ambiguity in the certain actions that characters take, particularly with respect to the ending. But there is no moral judgment placed on the hero's journey in Campbell. This is not inverting that expectation. You could argue that it's inverting expectations for fantasy heroes as a whole within the genre, which I suppose I see, although it's certainly not the first to do that with the rise of grimdark in general. It's certainly not doing anything to subvert Campbell, and I'm not a Campbell defender here. I don't love a lot of what he did, but as a template for structure, he's, clearly used a lot to this day. I've read Babel too. There's a video about Babel on this channel. It's obviously at least a bit higher on this list. To spoil it a little, I had many of the same issues with the execution of that book on the moment to moment, but I at least saw what people liked there more broadly. Here, I just didn't. At number 109 is Two Serpents Rise by Max Gladstone. You'll see Gladstone a fair bit higher on this list, but Two Serpents Rise would have made me give up on the craft sequence were it not for friends correctly assuring me that it gets better. The book's protagonist is less interested in the plot than I am, and surrounded by an uncharismatic supporting cast. In Gladstone's defense, the novel is inspired by Occupy Wall Street, and obviously influenced by the disillusionment many felt in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. That intent doesn't really make this disinterest a good thing, though. The book doesn't do anything to maintain reader interest in absence of the character's own. That's not to say that it doesn't try. The prevalence of Whedon-esque empty one-liners throughout the dialogue is a clear attempt at comedy meant to establish charisma in its cast and keep the reader invested. Its actual function was to make a cast largely without personality even harder to tolerate, and to date the book to a period shortly after the release of and massive popularity of the Avengers. And, oh look. Even putting all that aside, the plot isn't on the same level as the other books in the series. The only thing this book has going for it is the imaginative and well-conveyed world-building characteristic of the series as a whole. I'm given to understand that the craft sequence converges later on and that the events of all books end up being important. I'll get back to you on that if it's true, but if it's not, this one's definitely worth skipping. At number 108 is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is an interesting concept. A wandering judge goes about the country solving crimes and rendering verdicts across this vaguely fantastical land. It's a really great idea and had me excited as a general mystery fan. Unfortunately, it's also a perfect example of things happening merely for the convenience of the plot. At one point, the protagonist is trapped in a manor house and taken into this central room to be questioned, and there's just a tunnel there in that central room for some reason, and she runs down it to escape. Its story suffers from a need to make many smaller, or rather a need that many smaller, lower stakes fantasy stories seem to feel to inject a grand conspiracy where none is necessary, because there's this idea that people aren't going to be interested in a story unless it has these grand world-ending stakes. I would have been perfectly happy just going around seeing this dude judge on crimes, but we have to have this society upending conspiracy because we can't trust readers to enjoy lower stakes in 2022, I guess. Beyond an atrocious plot, the characters and prose aren't bad, but they aren't particularly good either, and the narrator spends too much time explaining their emotions. It's all certainly not enough to make up for the plot, and that central judge mystery selling point takes a back seat after the first 50 pages or so, so if that's what you're here for, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Number 107, The Grace of Kings, was another terrible disappointment I was really looking forward to. As I said in my review, there's a good story in here somewhere, but it's marred by unreadably bad dialogue, insistent on pausing every other conversation so characters can explain context to each other that they already know for the reader's convenience, because God forbid we ever ask the reader to make an inference, right? That fact, combined with the prevalence of poorly written narrative info dumps devoid of any real style, makes the book feel more like half a story broken up by a series of encyclopedia entries, which is it's not a bad world, but I don't think it's sufficiently interesting to merit that treatment. It's not the sort of world building I'd go and watch hour-long YouTube videos about. At number 106 is The Cartographers by Punk Shepherd. This has a fantastic concept and a really great premise for a plot. It's a map-based mystery that evoked Tintin without the racist caricatures. This whole, running around finding clues and secrets and then going and researching them in the library. That's a really cool vibe that I want more in my fantasy stories. But in this book, it's paired with some of the worst execution on a sentence-to-sentence level I've ever read. I get into many specific examples in my full review on Goodreads, but the general gist is that the book goes out of its way to pause the storytelling to exposit at length on any piece of background information the moment it's mentioned. The prose is consistently awkward and clunky, and characterization is delivered primarily through the narrator telling you what to think about people as they're introduced. God forbid we be asked to make an inference yet again. The writing itself would have this placed closer to the very bottom of the list, but I rank it this high because I think that if all of my criticisms aren't the sort of thing that bother you, you'll probably like everything else. I'll include my favorite line from the book here just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, though. You want to keep it at your apartment in a completely unsecured location with no security whatsoever? At number 105 is Kingdoms of Death by Christopher Rocchio. This is the worst book in the Sun Eater series by a pretty wide margin. I suppose I haven't read Ashes of Man yet, so I can't really say that, but the worst of the first four by far. It's hard to find anything good to say about this book that wouldn't just lead to praise of the other books in the series. It's a lot more overexplained, characterized by protracted battle sequences and death monologues that evoke a fraction of the emotion they try very hard to squeeze out. This is where the series' inability to establish a compelling and supporting cast really catches up to it, because when a member of the cast dies, it almost feels like the book is being self-conscious. It knows the series hasn't done enough to endear this character to the reader, so it tries to compensate by just telling you to be sad. Unsurprisingly, that doesn't really work. There are several completely flat villains also who spend all of their time monologuing at Hadrian as they twirl their mustaches. This book also is the death of the nuance with which Rocchio previously depicted his complex spacefaring societies, replaced by the brave Catholic freedom fighters battling the unambiguously evil and or brainwashed space Soviets. Yeah, I thought that was a joke at first too, actually. And as I said in my review, I'm all for criticizing Stalin, but there's no nuance in this critique. It's completely unoriginal and bland and reduces everything to this black and white we haven't seen in Rocchio's writing before, and I hope not to see again. It's a very high school history class capitalist understanding of what the Soviet Union was. And, you know what I mean. If you've ever taken a high school history class, you know what I mean. At number 104, we have The Black Tides of Heaven by Neon Yang. This is where we start to get into books that I have at least a few positive thoughts on. Black Tides of Heaven is told in this really interesting world that uses fantasy to talk about gender in a pretty unique way, at least as far as I've seen in the genre. That said, the book doesn't seem to know what it's about beyond that. It's propelled by strangely contrived conveniences that destroy the legitimacy of the threat its Central Empire poses. It undermines its own messages at every turn. Its concluding act is an absolute betrayal of its characters. And maybe that's handled in the next book, but misunderstanding of the stakes of its own world aside, it's still a major break for the characterization of the people. The prose is also bad. These men were men who hurt other people for a living, and the children seemed to come to an agreement, and that agreement was not to put up a fight, are great examples of sentences that do not belong in published novels. For most of the book, I really couldn't manage to invest myself in the plot and felt most engaged in noticing shit like that. I'm gonna pause for a moment to take a sip of my tea. At number 103, we have City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. Entry high on the Esquire list. Lots of things to say about the Esquire list. This is another interestingly built world that falls on its face in execution. When you're writing a story about political intrigue, a form of conflict defined by the subtle consequences and implications of small actions, a surefire way to kill reader engagement is to immediately break away from each such action or piece of dialogue and have the narrator explain the significance of that moment. Where is the incentive for the reader to actually engage with or think about the plot? when they're told exactly what to think the moment anything happens. This extends to the book's handling of its characters as well, flattening any nuance in the reader's relationship to them. The failure to trust the reader's curiosity here ironically murders that same curiosity and leaves me completely disinterested in continuing a book, and certainly not a series. At number 102, we have Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is actually worse about the over-explanation than several of the books that find themselves just below it. That's mostly because it earns a few points back by way of its generally stronger concept and plot. If you want to hear my thoughts on Babel in greater depth, I made a whole video about it in late November, but the TLDR is that its insistence on over-explaining everything to the reader as plainly as possible gives you no space to respond to its emotional beats or relate to its characters at anything beyond the most superficial level. Maybe that's why it's so popular on TikTok. At number 101 is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. This is another book defined by an aversion to subtlety, and at this point you might be noticing a theme at the bottom of this list. Sorry if it's getting a little repetitive, but at least I'm consistent. This is a very tell-don't-show book, or at least a show-then-tell book, which is sometimes even more annoying. It's unfortunate because I thought it had some genuinely interesting things to say about imperialism. It just took the word say a bit too literally. Its insistence on structuring itself around a central plot also hurt the story overall because the plot was so weak, and the focus clearly wanted to be on these individual vignettes of Mahit's experience in this culture that's consuming her own. And in the moments that it embraced that identity, it felt a lot stronger because it ultimately is just about Mahit's individual experience in this culture, more than it is about the broader conflict. That angle was really good, and it's sad to think that a version of this book that really focused that identity could have been genuinely great. Because unlike basically every other book so far on this list, the prose itself is actually really good. It's just the way that that prose is used to tell a story I find objectionable. At number 100 is The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is one of the many reasons these blurbs have gotten shorter. So many of my criticisms of these books boil down to the same thing, a lack of subtlety in either characterization, plot, or expression of themes. The Last Wish is guilty of all three of these, the first two in particular. Sapkowski is not particularly good at exposition. He favors these bland dialogue infodumps that read extremely unnaturally, not in the good stylized way either, which we'll get to at the higher points on this list. This is especially infuriating in a collection of short stories wherein the same bad expository techniques are used to start each story. If you're dreading the end of a story, it should be out of some well-crafted suspense, not the fear of the next story's inevitable weak beginning. At number 99 is Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This marks a considerable step up in the quality on this list. If it was a tier list, this book would be the next tier up easily. Unlike basically everything else we've talked about so far, I have no complaints about lack of subtlety or quality of prose. In fact, if this book had ended around its own halfway point, it would be a good 30 spots higher, if not more. The problem is that second half. After Katrina's big performance, the conflict simply loses all stakes. The book pretends to maintain a conflict, but at no point am I convinced that it will be anything but a minor inconvenience to our central protagonists. The central romance, to which the second half devotes considerable time, also falls flat for me, mainly because only one of its characters gets any meaningful characterization. She's good, but you need both characters to make the relationship work. Beyond that, Katrina's participation in the second half of the story is pretty minimal. I don't think there's anything wrong with just having a nice, low-stakes, feel-good story, especially for a trans character who's clearly gone through hell earlier in her life, but there still needs to be an actual story, and that's just not here. All right, here we go. We're back. Number 98, Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb. There is a lot more Robin Hobb to come, mostly higher or much higher on this list, but for now we arrive at the bad ones. And really, what happened here? The Rainwald Chronicle just doesn't even feel like it's Hobbs writing. The entire subseries has this strange obsession with going out of its way to explain and re-explain every minute detail, and not just details of the book, but anything that the readers wouldn't remember, or would rather remember from the previous book in Realm of the Elderlings. So, don't bother remembering. We're just going to spend a paragraph reminding you what a live ship is, who Maltavestrid is, how Fool's Fate ended. Forget what happened last chapter? Let's remind you of that too. It's not even explaining away the subtext. It's literally giving you a book report on the events of its own previous books. So much needless extra bloat. There are some really good plot points here, but the book also chooses to focus on its own least interesting subplots. And I'm not just talking about Blood of Dragons here. I'm really talking about all of the Rainwald Chronicle. But it drags them out across 3 or even all 4 books. And it's a really unfortunate downturn in quality. If the Rainwald Chronicle had cut out the fluff and been about half as long, it could have fit with the best of Realm of the Elderlings. But as it stands, it's the worst subseries by far, and Blood of Dragons is the worst member of that subseries. At number 97 is The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan. I just wish that the Wheel of Time could tell its story without throwing in all this other nonsense on the side. Robert Jordan had a lot of ideas about the fundamental natures of men and women and wanted to make sure that you knew them. You can tell that these are Jordan's ideas, not his characters, because no amount of wisdom or growing worldly experience over the course of 5 quite long books leads a single character to once question their strange ideas about masculinity and femininity, ubiquitous across the world's otherwise varied and unique cultures. I've been told this changes eventually, but we're 5 books in, and it feels like our protagonists have grown no wiser for that time, except for maybe Rand. Beyond the book's odd understanding of gender and obvious spanking fetish is a disservice this and the last book do to Matt, who was becoming my favorite character in The Dragon Reborn and does nothing remotely interesting in the 2 subsequent books. The series' obsession with this reluctant hero archetype gets old when it's multiple characters across what have now been 5 books. You have to get over that reluctance eventually. The series continues to be frustrating, focusing on side plots that I don't care about and still over-explaining its characterization. Rand and Moraine carry this book and have been the best part of the series for the last 2 entries. Rand in particular represents a simultaneously sympathetic and genuinely intimidating presence. Jordan captures the precariousness of his mental state very well. Nynaeve was shaping up to be a similarly great character, if not better, in the last book, but now she's just saddled with this tedious circus subplot. I don't have a problem with fantasy authors writing romance in concept, but I very often do in execution because a lot of them are extraordinarily bad at it. Jordan is a prime example. If you took all of the attempts at romance out of this series, I'd probably have finished it already because it would be about 4 books shorter and because I'd actually maintain the will to keep reading. All of these complaints laid out, there are a few things to like here. If you ignore the handling of gender, Jordan's cultures are otherwise exceptionally well built and shown to the reader quite well. The central thesis behind the series, the notion that those in power will pursue selfish interests even in the face of the apocalypse, is obviously relevant and well explored. He writes action and is one of the few fantasy authors for whom I wouldn't mind seeing more battle scenes. I just wish we could focus more on the good stuff here. At number 96 is Dragon Keeper by Robin Hobb. This is another Rainwald's book with the same problems as Blood of Dragons. I place it above because there's a good section at the beginning that it's at least enjoyable for a few chapters. Thanks to Rhythma for pointing that out in a video we did together over the summer. The Pigeon Keepers, whose correspondences fill each chapter's epigraphs, are probably the best part of this series, though, which isn't exactly high praise for everything else. At number 95 is The Haunting of Tramcar 15 by P. Jelly Clark. Clark's world building is fantastic. He imagines this vibrant alternative Cairo in which the appearance of magic curtailed European imperialism. Exploring that world really is the best part of this book, which I suppose is a nice way of saying that plot and characters aren't all that interesting. It's that common problem of over-explanation again, which is particularly unfortunate in a novella, which really should have even less flab than a full novel. At number 94 is Rogue Protocol by Martha Wells. This is the weakest Murderbot book, but it's still fun overall. The first chunk of the novella is spent rehashing the plots of the previous books in the series, which, again, is an especially bad thing to do in a novella when that rehashing takes up such a meaningful percentage of your page count. Character dynamics also aren't quite up to the standard of the better Murderbot novellas, which we'll talk about higher on this list. At number 93 is Lord Foul's Bane by Stephen R. Donaldson. I fully recognize that many of my issues with this book are just my burnout with Tolkien rewrites, but the plot here just felt so similar to the Fiona of Our Tapestry and The Eye of the World and, well, Fellowship of the Ring. I understand that the point here is to recontextualize things through the more pessimistic and ostensibly adult worldview we get both of and through Thomas Covenant, and Covenant himself is an interesting character, but it's simply not enough to compensate for an utterly uninteresting plot and few, if any, memorable supporting characters. I mean, I remember Saltart Foam Follower because he's got a funny name, but fully nothing about this book stuck with me beyond the opening sequence when Covenant is still in our world. It pains me to say, but I think it might have been better if he'd just stayed there. Number 92 is Harrow the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is a really hard book to criticize without spoiling. To keep things vague, my main critique is of the narrative voice, which is heavily compromised throughout most of the book, purely in the interest of maintaining a mystery. Another instance where, if the author worried less about trying to outsmart their audiences, their writing would improve astronomically. Beyond that is a lessening of the comedy overall, largely resulting from the fact that where once only Gideon was trying to be funny and everyone else took themselves seriously, now everyone is trying to be funny, so there's no straight man, to use an especially ironic comedy term, off of whom to bounce your jokes. When it's all punchlines all the time, none of them end up being that funny. It also feels like it's trying a bit too hard in a way that compromises its world building. The first book is extremely quirky, but it manages that in a way that ultimately reinforces its characters and its world. This book acts quirky to the point of undermining the status of many of its characters and its central conflict. I think this is a symptom of both aforementioned issues with the book's comedy. Because the narrator isn't being as overtly funny, the world itself and the dialogue feel like they need to be funny to compensate, and that undermines both the world and the characters speaking their lines after a certain point. Number 92, we're back to the Rainwild Chronicles with Dragonhaven. This has the same problems as the other books, but I give it bonus points because there's a really good scene at the end. That's literally the only difference here. At number 90 is Exit Strategy by Martha Wells. This is still a little over-explainy and, like most of the series, weak on world building, but benefits from the reintroduction of some better characters with whom Murderbot has more chemistry. And because its issues are less pronounced, it's able to benefit more from Murderbot's own character, and particularly its internal monologue, the series' greatest strength, in my opinion. At number 89 is maybe a controversial take, Tigana by Guy Gavriel K, another one from the Esquire list. This is a beautifully written book that might as well have no plot at all. What little story is present relies entirely on the illusion created by Kay's beautiful prose, convincing you to be interested in a plot that is propelled primarily by characters vibing and doing things just because how could something so beautifully described have happened any other way? It also fails to trust its reader to grasp what is otherwise well-written subtext, explaining it immediately, which always irritates me. Finally, one of its most important characters has no plot reason to exist after the halfway point, but we just sort of stay in her head anyway while she doesn't do anything. At number 89 is... Wait, that was number 89. Now we're at number 88, The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams. This was really disappointing to me. I went in with maybe too high expectations. I knew it was an inspiration for Robin Hobb, and I knew that it was this long monolith in the genre, and I was really excited to have this series, a whole series to look forward to. And there's just nothing so bad about it, but beyond some very clumsy exposition, but it's just nowhere lives up to its reputation. You get, especially when it's compared to Robin Hobb, it's just okay. It's good at points, but it never justifies the Hobb comparison in my mind. At number 87 is The Time of Contempt by Andrzej Sapkowski. This does exposition a little bit better than Blood of Elves, I think. You'll note that it's lower on the list, though. It loses points because it's even worse at writing women. The banquet scene made me cringe, and really not in the way the author intended. The scheming element is one thing, as most of the women Geralt interacts with are witches, who by the nature of their craft are adept in political maneuvering and manipulation. But the time dedicated to describing, oh, this woman is revealing even more skin at the political banquet than the last one, and oh look, they all scheme to get Geralt to sleep with them instead of Yennefer, because that's what women are like, right? All of them, every single one with no exception. We don't see a single character subvert this expectation in the world. You know, it's one thing to set up a social expectation. Maybe this is the sort of the way that society pushes people to behave. But when you don't present an alternative, you're really saying that, no, this is actually the natural way that people are. It's a weird juxtaposition because in some places these books are extremely progressive. There's a based pro-abortion take in one of the short stories, but then you're actually characterizing and describing these people themselves. It's just really weird and kind of gross. At number 86, we have The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. This is an exploration of Lovecraft's incredible influence on the horror genre and on LaValle's personal conflict with the, extreme racism and xenophobia matched with the influence that he took from Lovecraft. And viewed purely through this lens, Ballad of Black Tom is excellent and explores Lovecraft meaningfully. Unfortunately, the story is marred by this really clunky prose, an issue I didn't find in the other LaValle novel, much higher on this list, and the characterization is just okay. It's an interesting exploration of Lovecraft, but it never really manages to tell a good story on its own. At number 85 is Rivers of London by Ben Aronovich. This is a fine magic detective novel that loses points for its refusal to just be about a simple magical mystery and instead, has this need to, again, incorporate a broader city-threatening conspiracy. Its prose is nothing to write home about. It's occasionally funny and a decent read across the board, but it used to be a fair bit higher on this list. As I've gotten further from it, I've realized that it just isn't staying with me, and I have no real interest in picking up the next book in the series. Number 84 is Blood of Elves by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is a step down from the short stories in terms of exposition, if such a thing can be believed. It's possible that the dialogue infodumps that start each of his stories feel much better in the original Polish, but I have to review the books as I read them, and the translation, it's just a bunch of characters going out of their way to explain a conflict both are a part of to each other on the most basic level. The introduction of tensions between human and elves is horribly handled. The dialogue and prose are repetitive and generally mediocre. On the flip side, the political intrigue and the mystery around Ciri are fascinating, and the broader strokes of the story's conflict have me interested enough to overlook writing which, over a weaker plot, would have had me put the series down already. And getting back into it, we have Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. This is one of the better Murdervault stories, moving into the realm of murder mystery, something that was surprisingly fun to see through this character's eyes. All my praise is the same, and my criticisms are still relevant, but less so. At number 82, we have A Dead Gin in Cairo by P. Jelly Clark. This is better than Haunting of Tramcar 15, thanks in part to its more interesting cast as well as its better narrative style. It spends a bit less time over explaining character intentions, similar overall with the same strengths and weaknesses though. At number 81 is Unaccustomed Earth by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is a collection of short stories, some of which are excellent and some of which overstay their welcome. In retrospect, I may have been too harsh on this book, but there were bits of its prose I found really irritating, especially grating in the stories I cared less about. I'll probably come back to Lahiri maybe in novel form, because there's a lot that I liked here as well. At number 80 is All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is the first Murderbout novella, and one of the strongest. It benefits from being the first of a series because it introduces all of its questions about the nature of humanity, life, and gender and corporate greed, which are all expanded upon in the following novellas, but often not enough to eclipse their introduction. It also presents one of the more interesting mysteries in the series, which is always good. And continuing on with Murderbot, we have number 79, Network Effect. This is the only full-on novel, and it's better than most of the novellas for one reason that we'll get into when we talk about the best of the novellas a bit higher on this list. It loses a few points because Wells' style is clearly best suited to the novella, and the novel starts to drag a bit in a few places as a result. It feels like she's really sort of padding things out to make it a full novel's length. At number 78, we have A Good Fall by Ha Jin, another collection of short stories, each of which examines some element of the Chinese-American immigrant experience. I found most of these stories too lacking in narrative style to say much to me, but there were 3 exceptions that elevated this collection, and if considered alone, would have a spot much closer to the top of this list. The stories were best to me when they pushed the bounds of reality. I think short story collections are hard to rank here because both Jin and Lahiri are clearly better writers than most of the people this far down on this list, and when their stories were strong, it really showed. I just couldn't keep that interest in each of them for the stories that didn't work as well. I think this means I just don't love short stories that much, because these are definitely two authors I'll come back to in novel form. At number 77, we have Fool's Quest by Robin Hobb. This is the weakest Realm of the Elderlings book outside of the Rainwild Chronicle. It maintains a lot to recommend it. It follows two of the best characters I've ever read, after all, but it does so little with its spectacular cast, and to me exemplifies Hobb's worst tendencies as a writer. I won't talk about it for too long here because I already have a 40-minute video on this channel devoted to analyzing this final Rote trilogy, but still, despite its flaws, I think it earns its spot this high thanks to Hobb's wonderfully crafted world and her ability to so seamlessly immerse the reader in her character's joy and suffering. What do we got here? At number 76 is Artificial Condition, the best Murderbot novella, thanks in large part to the dynamic between Murderbot and Art. Also, the highlight of Network Effect. The two characters play off of each other phenomenally and represent the best of what the series has to offer in its exploration of the meaning of sentience and its general robotic wit in dialogue. At number 75 is Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. This ranks so far above Kingdoms of Death as the second weakest book in Sun Eater that it's almost comical. The story has its problems, primarily in its first half, where it bears a little too much resemblance to both Dune and The Name of the Wind for my taste, as well as showing prose that's a little purple even for me at times. It also fails to really establish a solid supporting cast, something we talked about in Kingdoms of Death, but despite all that, Hadrian is a fantastic lens through which to view this equally fascinating universe, and as the story goes on, we really get to see more of that. I think if you're struggling with the first half, it's worth pushing through because the second half really picks up and the next two books stay with that. At number 74 is Sword of Destiny by Andrzej Sapkowski. This has the least awful, though still bad, expositional style of the Witcher books so far. This is the second collection of short stories, by the way. It takes place before the first full novel. This book is carried by the relationship between Geralt and Ciri, but it's solid almost all the way through, with only one bad story to be found within. Everywhere else, it ranges from good to great, I'd say, although mostly good. At number 73 is Magician Apprenticed by Raymond D. Feist. This is the first book in the Rift War series, the extraordinarily long Rift War series. And it doesn't feel like it's doing anything particularly special. It was pretty standard boy grows up in a castle, pulled into political and military life story. Obviously, it's one of the originators of that format, so I suppose it's doing something special in that. But it is still the kind of story we've seen many times before. It does add a bit to with its use of the titular rift, and obviously gains points, again, for being an early adopter. But its main draw is just that it manages to be a fun story in this familiar format. It has compelling characters and solid writing, so even though the general plot and the general gist of the story is familiar, it works. It works on its own. At number 72, we have Middle Game by Shannon McGuire. This explores a surprisingly well-realized sibling relationship that is more than enough to carry most of the book. Roger and Dodger are both fantastic characters, and some members of the supporting cast work admirably to keep up with them, though I'd say the supporting cast in general is a weakness. I have two non-issues that I'll cover just because it's fun. One, I was promised more chess than I got. The cover sports a big pawn, and the title is just a word, but considering the cover has very clear chess connotations. One character plays and is said to be quite good, but there's not really any deeper reference made to the game that would interest someone picking up the book for that reason. Second, the supposed math genius Dodger is presented a lot more like an engineer than a mathematician in terms of her characterization and skill set. She's inhumanly gifted at carrying out complex computations and using that ability to design systems around those computations. This is a pretty common misconception, but high-level math isn't just computing really complicated equations. It's a lot more about advanced logic and problem solving, proving things generally, which usually means more abstraction. The ability to design systems based on computation is certainly an admirable and very valuable skill, but it's the skill of an engineer, not a mathematician. My primary actual issue with this book is that its antagonist might as well not be a character. He has no clear motivation and less personality. He could have just as easily been a force of nature, which, as we'll see, is something that can work if that's what you're going for, but that's not the case here. At number 71, we have Three Parts Dead by Max Gladstone. Speaking of gaps between the worst and second worst books in a series, part of my disappointment with Two Serpents Rise was just how much worse it is than Three Parts Dead. A fantastic start to the craft sequence, introducing a brilliant and uniquely, or just a really genuinely unique fantasy world, observed by a solid cast of characters and a complicated and compelling central plot. Three Parts Dead is really one of the most unique and most interestingly conceived worlds I've read this year. It's doing nothing. It's not interacting much with the standard tropes of the fantasy genre. It really feels like it is taking its own path and building its own ideas. Obviously, the fact that it's as low as it is on the list means that the writing didn't quite live up to my expectations, but it was still good, and it was still totally worth reading, especially just for that world again. Number 70 is City of Dragons by Robin Hobb. This is the best book in the Rainwild Chronicle, and it's not even close. It's the shortest in that subseries by about 100 pages, and I'm convinced that all of that difference is accounted for in the heaps of over-explanation of plot and character present in the other three books, but mercifully absent from this one. It's helped along by the fact that it does some of the best world building in all of Realm of the Elderlings, and though its plot is not fantastic, it's focusing a bit too much on Thymara's one now very tired dilemma still. And it, maintains those stylistic issues of the earlier series. It's clearly stronger than the other three books, even in terms of plot, and especially in terms of stylistic execution. At the nice number 69, we have The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett. I think Pratchett here still hasn't quite gotten his plotting down, but the book is so relentlessly hilarious that I can't rank it any lower. No book has ever made me laugh as consistently, and I'm given to understand that Pratchett only gets better. The Talking Trees section is one of the funniest chapters in any book I've ever read. I still rank it this low because, again, the plot doesn't quite do it for me. It's clearly more plot and a better structured plot than there is in The Color of Magic, but I think it's still missing something that we will see stronger, though still a weakness, in the next Pratchett book, the one other book that I read this past year that's a little higher on this list. At number 68 is Full Fathom 5 by Max Gladstone. This is similar to Three Parts Dead in quality, but it gets a boost because I liked the protagonists more. Other than that, same criticisms and same praise. The world is the main draw here, and it remains really interesting and original. At number 67 is The Summer Tree by Guy K. This is really beautifully written, even if it is a Tolkien rewrite. In many ways, it's just, it's got a hell of a lot more plot than Tigana, even for that. And it has a lot more to recommend it stylistically than Thomas Covenant. On that second point, the Fiona of Our Tapestry's characters, that's the name of the series this is in, by the way, are surprisingly memorable, especially Paul and Dave, though I have to penalize the book for not writing women particularly well, with one key exception. At number 66, we'll go to the third book in the Fiona of Our Tapestry, The Darkest Road. This ends the trilogy and is almost identical in quality to the first book. I give it a slight boost because Darian is one of the best characters in the series, and this is really his book. Plot-wise, the book should rank much lower, but their characters and Kay's prose do a lot to elevate them. This book is the most rife with weird sex stuff, which is unfortunately common in Kay's writing. I didn't mention Tigana's bondage scene in that section, but it's a similar vibe to that. It's not bad enough to ruin an otherwise solid experience, but I have nothing against authors writing about sex. It just feels a little out of place here. At number 65 is The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. This is so heavily influenced by Faulkner without really capturing what makes Faulkner's Prussian commentary on the American South so masterful. Still, it's Tartt, and her writing combined with Harriet alone earned this book a decent placing, though it's certainly her weakest novel, and those two strengths are doing a lot of heavy lifting. At number 64, we have Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, who I understand is just a pseudonym for two other dudes. This is a really fun sort of sci-fi mystery that has a lot to say about colonial governments and power and corruption. Its characters are a weak point, though, as while none are bad, none are particularly great either. I'm told they improve as the series goes on, and I believe one of my friends told me that book 2 introduces another character who's fantastic, so I'm looking forward to that because I do plan on continuing this series eventually. It's just not a top priority right now. At number 63, we have The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman, which, while still good, falls short of the rest of his Dark Materials, which you'll see higher on this list. It fails to quite hit the highs of the second book, and its lows bring it lower than the first. It's a book where what minor issues I do have are fairly complicated, though, and I get into them more in my actual review on Goodreads. It's still fantastic overall, but it is really that, as an ending to a series, that I think it fails. Number 62 is Forge of Darkness by Steven Erikson, which does everything that the best Erikson books do. It explores the psyches of complex and fascinating characters in one of the most richly developed fantastical universes ever conceived, while maintaining that central element of universal compassion that almost defines Erikson writing. Unfortunately, this is probably the weakest of his books that I've read, largely thanks to an abundance of character navel-gazing that, while characteristic of his writing broadly, was too much for me in this book. If you want to hear about his best book, I have a video hopefully coming soon, but who knows. At number 61, we have The Changeling by Victor Laval. We get it, you're from New York. In all seriousness, while the New York worship was a little annoying, it's not as bad as I've seen elsewhere. This book has none of the problems with prose present in The Ballad of Black Tom. In fact, its introduction is one of the most evocative and beautifully written among all of the books on this list. The second half is the reason it doesn't find itself pushing the top 10. It fails to deliver on a lot of the mystique and promise established in the first half and ends up with a disappointing, drab series of payoffs. Still, it's impossible to take away that subtle progression from fairy to horror of the first few chapters, and if Laval ever does manage to deliver on that kind of promise, it will be one of the best books the genre has ever seen. At number 60, we have Witchmark by C.L. Polk. This is another magical mystery tour whose stakes get a little too high for its own good. We have this really nice combination of a good little murder mystery and a compelling gay romance. I know, a good romance in a fantasy book. I was surprised too. Then suddenly the fate of the entire country and maybe the entire world is at stake, and I yawn. But the writing is excellent, and it's a fun read overall. Unfortunately, this sequel does not come close to living up, and I didn't even read far enough to count it on this list, so it's better to take as a standalone, in my opinion. At number 59, we have Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. This is an incredible play in concept. The idea of this obsessive pursuit of career success over personal fulfillment and the way it destroys Willie's life is really great. I just wish the play itself would show more of that. There's nothing wrong with its execution, but I just like the play more in concept than I do in reality. At number 58, we have The Other Wind by Ursula K. Guin. This is the weakest Earthsea book, which is kind of like complaining that you're the dumbest person on the Manhattan Project. It loses some of the strength of the plots and prose in the earlier parts of the series, but it's still Le Guin. You can only put her so low. Sip of water. At number 57, we have Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This presents a fascinating mystery, space necromancy through the eyes of a unique and endlessly entertaining narrator who's nearly as clueless as the reader, which is really fun. It was a really good read overall, definitely worth checking out, but it doesn't feel like it's saying all that much, which is why I don't put it higher. I find that this book didn't stick with me as much as those that placed above it. I enjoyed it while I read it, but I don't think about it that much anymore. At number 56 is Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is a really difficult book to talk about. There's a lot of fascinating commentary on the way the rich exploit the poor, commentary just as, if not more, applicable today as it was over a century ago. Unfortunately, it's impossible to separate the book's class commentary from the regressive xenophobia tied to that commentary so tightly. As a story, though, it's still surprisingly entertaining, despite lending its influence to so many stories that turned it into a cliché. The epistolary style works really well here, and the now cliched archetypes that, we see these characters repeated in were actually really good and compelling characters way back when it originated. At number 55 is Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. This mixes all of my critiques of Fool's Quest with all the brilliance of the rest of the series to create the most mixed experience in Realm of the Elderlings. Again, I have a whole video talking about this final trilogy, but the second half of this book elevates it at least this high, whatever the first half does to drag it down. At number 54 is Moonwitch Spider King by Marlon James. This was the year of Marlon James for me, and yet this is the first of his books to appear on this list. You can probably infer how I feel about his writing from that. Moonwitch Spider King incorporates much of what's great in his writing, but also loses itself in its own digressions a little too much to rank higher than this. Its overfocus on Sogolon's mundane family life in the middle section drags on a little too long, and while that section as a whole adds to her story, it could have added just as much given about half the page time. Still, there's a lot to like, which I'll save for the first book in this series when it does appear. Number 55 is another Marlon James book, John Crow's Devil, his debut novel. It's weaker plot-wise than some of his later writing, but already shows his incredible ability to distinguish characters and establish personalities through dialogue. Unlike Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and Moonwitch Spider King, which my viewers might know because it's fantasy, this is more of a magic realist look at a small Jamaican town in the 50s. His storytelling and use of metaphor are fantastic even this early on. He's also just hilarious and has an uncanny ability to inject humor into otherwise bleak situations without compromising the overall tone. The use of magic realist elements makes this read really surreal and engrossing. At number 52, I have Howling Dark by Christopher Rocchio. This is a major step up from Empire Silence, where the originality of Rocchio's world building is able to shine and take center stage, and generally the weight and breadth of this galactic empire, as well as the world outside of its reach, really begins to sink in. It's a fantastic book for world building, especially if you appreciate sort of over-the-top use of sci-fi fantasy elements. Hadrian spends a lot of time alone, which surprisingly works in this book's favor thanks to his incredible strength as a character and the solid style of his internal monologue. I generally like books that establish better supporting casts, but when Sun Eater understands that Hadrian is its greatest strength by a mile and plays to that strength, it can be really good. I think part of the problem with Kingdom of Death was its refusal to recognize that weakness, its insistence on pretending it had a good supporting cast, on using them as if they were stronger, better established characters, only drawing more attention to its shortcomings as a novel. Howling Dark is the opposite. Similarly, Demon in White by Christopher Rocchio, book 3 in Sun Eater, is slightly better than Howling Dark if you put a gun to my head. Now we see Hadrian in the political sphere for large chunks of the book, where he's more navigating well-developed political systems than specific other characters, and it works exceptionally well, again, distancing him from the series' main weakness. The world building is on par with Howling Dark, and while the climax falls short for me, getting into a really protracted battle sequence that, while not uncommon throughout the series, really overstays its welcome here, its strongest section beats out any other part of the series, and I can't really say anything about it because it does just need to be experienced. It's that good. At number 50 is Equal Rights by Terry Pratchett. I don't think this was quite as funny as The Light Fantastic, though it is still very funny. It surpasses his two earlier books because it deals with a more cogent commentary on sexism in general and in academia in particular. It has a stronger plot than previous Discworld books, and though it's still that's still its greatest weakness, I'd say. Granny Weatherwax is a fantastic character, as is Esk, and Unseen University is a great location. Though the traveling sections and the locations they cover aren't quite as interesting as those in the earlier books. At number 49, not 59, I have The Night by Gene Wolfe. The narrative voice in The Night is really refreshing and well executed. Wolfe's prose serves Abel's strange, sort of semi-clueless voice well. You know, this is a classic trip from our world into this fantasy world, and Wolfe is really able to convincingly paint a clueless character trying to navigate that change. The book also makes excellent use of animal companions, each of whose voices, and yeah, they actually talk, are tailored really well to their characters. It's a less plot-driven novel and structured mostly around Abel's life in this strange new world, which works really well for what it is. I've seen reviews that say it's the same voice we get in all of Wolfe's books, which is concerning, and if that proves to be true, would revives this later entry in his bibliography down for me. But I'll just have to find that out on my own, I guess. Another sip. Have to pause and go refill that soon. At number 48 is Tales from Earthsea by Ursula K. Guin. This is a collection of short stories. It's placed 5th in the series, and it's probably my 5th favorite book in the series as well. 5 of the stories are excellent, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, and 1 is quite bad. Dark Rose and Diamond is the only reason this collection ranks this low, because the rest are at or above the level of her usual work. Beautifully written throughout and thought-compelling. Beautifully written, thoughtful, and compelling was what I have written here. If I had to rank the stories within it, I would go 5, Dark Rose and Diamond, the worst, the only one that I really don't like. 4 is The Finder, after a big jump up. 3 would be Dragonfly, which is, I believe, the last story. 2 would be The Bones of the Earth, after another big jump. And 1, number 1 on High Marsh, which individually rivals A Wizard of Earthsea, making it one of the best stories she wrote, at least in this world. At number 47, we have The Obelisk Gate, or maybe it's just Obelisk Gate, by N.K. Jemisin. This does fall short of the 5th season. This is the second book in the Broken Earth trilogy. But the 5th season isn't on this list because I read it in 2020. And I'd say this one falls short just because it has a little less going on, both narratively and stylistically. It drags a little bit in the middle. Otherwise, though, it's an excellent continuation from one of, if not the best book I read in 2020. Jemisin is one of the best currently working in the genre. She examines an almost entirely new facet of the very obvious allegory for racism set up in the first book, and in general, this series handles that allegory fantastically well, feeling like it always has a new point to make, and always in a way that fits in with and even augments the story being told. At number 46 is The Farthest Shore by Ursula K. Guin. This is on the weaker end of her novels only because I found the plot a little less compelling than its two predecessors, but it's written with the same care, and as I've said before, it is still Le Guin. At number 45 is Golden Fool by Robin Hobb. This is a masterclass in the tension it is possible to evoke in well-written political intrigue and the integration of said intrigue with world building. It's also an incredible exploration of its fantastic cast of characters, introducing and exploring both monumental changes in and the additions of new dynamics. It massively expands its world and sets up some of the best plot lines in the series. I loved Golden Fool, and its placement this low is a testament to the excellence of every book that ranks above. Like I said at the start, this list is not normally distributed. Everything from here on ranks pretty close together, and it's tough to differentiate. We're really entering the upper echelon as far as I'm concerned. And you could have even said that for the last 2 or 3 books behind it, but Golden Fool really marks a clear delineation for me. And speaking of the upper echelon, we have number 44, Medea by Euripides, translated by Oliver Taplin. I'll have a bit of a ramble about Euripides in general later on, but I really liked Medea. It's multifaceted tragedy. It's a multifaceted tragedy in which everyone is easy to both hate and empathize with. It contains complex commentary on power and gender roles and parenthood, and does a fantastic job conveying the wrongness of everything it depicts without feeling ham-fisted. Taplin's translation didn't do too much for me. It's part of a series that's ostensibly going for accuracy on a sentence-by-sentence basis, which I don't love. I wish I could just read it in the original ancient Greek, but not enough to actually put in the effort to learn the language. At number 43 is Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. This is absurd and hilarious. Vonnegut's writing is funny without ever undermining the disturbing tone of the story or the quality of his prose, and Cat's Cradle really does sort of push the bound. It breaks the bounds of reality, but it pushes them subtly to reach that breaking point in a way that's almost confusing. But yeah, just fantastic, really worth reading. And I'm looking forward to getting more Vonnegut. There is one more of his books higher on this list, but just generally reading more Vonnegut as I go on. Number 42 is Beowulf, translated by Seamus Heaney. This is the first of 2 stories on this list with no real authorial attribution. I'll have to read a few other translations beyond Heaney to get a real opinion, because I know he removes a lot of the absurd digressions that so inspired Tolkien, and depending on the style of their translation, those could either vastly boost or hamper its placement. The core story on its own is great, though, and helped along by intertextuality both with earlier myths and later fantasy that I think is really cool. At number 41 is The Wandering Fire by Guy Gavriel K. This is the middle child of the Fiona of Our Tapestry and the best book in that trilogy by far. It's beautifully written like the other 2 books, but it omits a lot of the weird writing about women and sex that hampers those, and it's also just the strongest section of the plot, and follows the most interesting characters other than Darien. I love Finn, and the repeated titular children's rhyme is a really wonderful and perfectly integrated piece of the series aesthetic. At number 40 is The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. This does an excellent job setting up its world, presented through Lyra's more childish worldview, only to immediately flip that on its head. It sort of mirrors Lyra's own maturation, and really enforces this separation that she was living under at the start of the series. It also describes just an incredibly well-conceived universe, rife with excellent imagery and characters, and it sets up all of Lyra's personal growth really well. It contains a really good critique of the organized part of many organized religions as well, which is always fun. And number 39 is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This is a beautifully simple book, and while I don't always agree with Hemingway's own views on masculinity, I think a more critical reading of the book can give way to some interesting ideas about pride and perseverance. It's also propelled by his aggressively simple yet really effective prose, and it's an astonishingly relaxing read for its subject matter. At number 38 is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This ranks above Obelisk Gate because it engages in some fantastic world building and wraps up the trilogy's story really nicely. The latter two books don't quite touch the heights the fifth season reached for me, but they still continue on admirably with its exploration of race and generational trauma, which is a really nice added layer in this book. I say nice, it's obviously really unpleasant, but nice in that it is well written and well handled. Stone Sky is a much tighter story from a plot perspective than Obelisk Gate, too, and it does more to flesh out its characters. There is a romance that I find ill-advised, and I felt like one or two of the characters I liked most in the earlier books aren't quite given their due here, but those are really small complaints in the face of what this series accomplished. Quick pause. What is this? All right. Number 37 is Bunny by Mona Awad. This is probably the weirdest book I read all year. I know from reading reviews that that's a problem for a lot of people, but I really liked it. I find Awad's prose really evocative, and her ability to maintain focus through a series of genuinely strange twists and turns really impressive. Bunny is a sort of dark academia, a term I'm really ambivalent about using, especially here, because I don't know how much Bunny actually critiques academia itself. Its main focus seems to be on pretense and the construction of false identity, which it integrates academia into that, but it doesn't really center it in a way that I think is genre defining. I feel like it is. Yeah, I just don't know that I would call it dark academia. That said, I think it does accomplish that critique really well, and it just has several really interesting characters reinforcing that. At number 36 is Absalom by William Faulkner. This is a really complicated book, and I love the nuanced look it takes at the vices of the post-Civil War South and human greed in general. That said, I think that this, more than any other book on the list, would benefit from a reread, because I will readily admit that I probably internalized about half of what I read generously. Faulkner's writing is really complex and dense and beautiful, but it demands a lot more attention than most. I think that attention is worth giving, but you need to be in the right space to read it. At least I do. I think a reread would probably bump this up the list, if anything. At number 35 is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Speaking of books that are easy to read, Infinite Jest is as dense as it is strange and meandering. It's hard to follow at times, and Wallace's writing is certainly not for everyone, but if you've read and liked anything he's written, you'll probably like this. If you haven't, I'd suggest starting with an essay or two just to see if it's your cup of tea, because 570,000 words is a bit of a commitment. But it's really funny, it's really sort of thought-provoking, and it gets into its characters' heads quite well. That said, I think it is also a little dated. It's certainly got elements that maybe wouldn't go over as well today, but it's a good book. I liked it. I think I would have to read it again. Again, it's just really, it's so long, it's so complicated. I think there's a lot being said here. Wallace is really railing against a lot of modern media presentation and consumption here, which I agree with in places, but I also find that I disagree with Wallace in a lot of places, and I still enjoy reading him just because I think that he makes his points so well that even if I think they're kind of dumb, I still like hearing what he has to say. Number 34 is The Children of Húrin by J.R.R. Tolkien. This finds itself the lowest ranked Tolkien book on this list, and I still really liked it, obviously. It has a fantastic story, and Turin is one of Tolkien's strongest characters. I think the books ranked higher take better advantage of his greatest strengths as a writer, though. He's both a fantastic writer of dialogue, paired with this more zoomed-in event-by-event storytelling, which he uses masterfully in Lord of the Rings, and of this more pulled-back, cursory story that covers millennia and creates an incredible sense of scale and awe, like the Silmarillion. Children of Húrin falls somewhere in the middle and just feels like it isn't quite leveraging either of those strengths to its fullest. That said, its placement this high should make clear that it's absolutely worth reading, though I would suggest saving it until after the Silmarillion, mostly just to be able to make sense of everything more easily. At number 33 is A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James. This is a weird fever dream of a novel, following a diverse cast of characters all tangentially related to the 1976 attempted assassination of Bob Marley, who is referred to only as the singer for the book's duration. It's a devastating look at the scars left on Jamaica by its history as a British colony that persists to this day. It explores crime, poverty, foreign government meddling with great care for all involved, and I do really mean all, spending just as much time in the heads of the foreign meddlers and criminal leaders. Its sparing use of magic realist elements enhance the feeling that it's all just a collective nightmare. The book, I'd say this more than any of his others, drives home Marlon James's brilliance with characterization through dialogue as well, though it is not the highest ranked of his books on this list. We'll get to that. Number 32 is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. This is an exploration of the lost generation post-World War I, and while material conditions today don't much resemble the society Hemingway depicted or lived in, the persistent purposeless feeling throughout the book will likely hit home for many in the 2020s as well as it did in the 1920s. If you're looking for a story with a tight, summarizable plot, you might want to look somewhere else, and if you're looking for an answer to all that purposelessness, I didn't find it here, but as an exploration of that feeling and of what it does to people, it is without parallel. Number 31 is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is just fantastic. Jane's voice is incredible, and she's surrounded by beautiful writing as she makes her way through this surreal and unfair existence. I think there's some really great commentary on family. There's just a fantastic set of character dynamics. Jane relates to everybody in a really interesting and believable way here. And, you know, it's helped along by Bronte's excellent prose. Number 30, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, is an absurdist sci-fi look at the events of World War II and what war does to those who experience it. It's hilarious and grim, and yet surprisingly easy to read. I never found this, dense or difficult in the way that I did a lot of the other books, sort of towards the top of this list. I also think the really absurd sci-fi elements come to the front more here than they do in Catch-22. What the hell am I saying? In Cat's Cradle. Slaughterhouse-Five, great. Number 29, Tahanu by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a tough one to rank relative to the other best Earthsea novels because I think Tahanu is a tough one to rank relative to the other best Earthsea novels, but I think I ultimately have to place it third in the series. It has a stronger plot than The Farthest Shore, and it's better written overall than the two that succeed it, but when I finished it, I was ready to call it the best book in the series, but after sitting with it for a little bit, it just feels a little too heavy-handed in delivering its much-needed response to the sexism implicit in the earlier Earthsea books. It's a good response, it's a good idea, it's beautifully written and tells a consistently compelling story, but I could say the same for the first two books in the series, both of which fall a little higher, though neither is on this list because I read them in 2021. Before I talk about this next book, I want to preface with something. I might give the impression that I have some sort of beef with New York City, and that's not true. I've been there several times and really enjoyed myself each time. If it weren't so obscenely expensive, I could see myself living there. Anyway, The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. This is the second time I've done Donna Tartt is a fantastic Bildungsroman all the way through, shifting tones seamlessly with the changing circumstances of Theo's life and presenting almost comically flawed characters in juxtaposition with its intentionally idealized and almost fetishized picture of New York. I usually hate books about New York, or at least the setting lowers them in my estimation. We get it, you're from New York is a running joke. And I pull that out basically whenever a book gets a little too horny for the Big Apple. The Goldfinch really subverts that, though. It's almost mocking the fetishization of the city by presenting every stereotype and cliche you hear from people singing its praises through the lens of its obviously flawed and unreliable narrator. I think it gets bonus points for that from me, but it's a great book either way. Like the best of Rocchio, it plays to Theo its greatest strength by staying in his head. Unlike Sun Eater, however, it still has a solid supporting cast to fall back on when it needs them, and it uses them expertly as well. It's a really compelling story. It's just a fantastic look at this character's life, and I think Tartt writes Theo really believably. Number 27 is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This is, despite its intentional anachronism and history bending, one of the most brutally real depictions of American slavery I've ever read. It is often difficult to read, as it should be, but it's also beautifully written and consistently nerve-wracking. The jarring changes made to American history only serve to highlight what stays the same through Whitehead's own depiction. Number 26 is Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. This is a strange Bildungsroman both for Salim Sinai and the country of India as a whole. It's written so that this character's life experiences mirror the history of India. And that's a really interesting concept, and it's wonderfully strange. It's well executed, but despite all of that, I found it slipping down this list as the year progresses. I think part of that is that its characters don't always feel like characters. In its gestures at broader Indian history, it can sort of distort them into something that doesn't quite feel human. I don't find myself thinking about it quite as much anymore either. I imagine a stronger understanding of Indian history would help considerably with that, and maybe if I acquire such an understanding, I'll revisit this book, but I think that would be the main reason I would come back to it. Number 25 is The Bacchae by Euripides, translated by both William Arrowsmith and Gilbert Murray. The Bacchae finds itself a fair ways above Medea, and that's intentional. I like Medea, but this is, I think, rightly regarded as Euripides' best play. It's much more complex, and while it's unlikely Euripides wrote it with the intent of a feminist or post-colonial text in the 5th century BCE, the existence of those readings and adaptations speaks to the depth that's always been present. It's also helped along by Murray's translation, nothing against Arrowsmith, but reading it in his well-composed verse was just a much nicer experience. It probably doesn't lend itself so well to being performed in that translation, but if you're going to just read it or listen to it as a book, I'd definitely go for Murray. Number 24, I have Dune by Frank Herbert, which has some of the best executed and maintained tension I've read in a long time. Herbert uses his third-person omniscient voice expertly to get into everyone's head, giving the reader just enough information to start to piece together bits of scheming as things fall apart around them. It's a fascinatingly and fantastically built world, and it's surprisingly well written throughout. I do blame Dune for a lot of the bad political intrigue I've read that's clearly taken the wrong lessons from Herbert. He stays in characters' heads, he does explain their emotions a bit, but it's all done in the service of upping the central tension. It's an invitation to the reader that says, here, this character's emotions are secondary to the scheme they're trying to unravel, and that's what I really want you to engage with. Many, unfortunately, see this and say, yes, I should fully explain every character thought up to and including their detailed understanding and interpretation of the nuances of each political action. That's how we get City of Stairs, for example. Number 23 is Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. This was my favorite book in Realm of the Elderlings at the time that I read it. Its slow start pays off quickly as it escalates into one of the most moving books in the series, introducing several fantastic new characters, slowly reacclimating the reader to fits, and providing the single best depiction of grief and mourning I've ever read. The two later books in the series that two later books in Realm of the Elderlings still stand above it is a testament to Hobb's brilliance. Number 22 is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, translated by David Green. I'm not fully up on my classical theater discourse, and I'm not really sure if people care about the Sophocles versus Euripides debate, though actually I'm sure someone out there does. Maybe I'm not allowed an opinion because I can't read ancient Greek, but if I am, I want it out there that I'm Team Sophocles all the way. It's nothing against Euripides, I obviously like his stuff a lot too, but Oedipus, which is the lower ranked of the two Sophocles plays on this list, by the way, is just such a tightly constructed story. Maybe I just look for a little more plot structure. I certainly think Sophocles does that better than Euripides, maybe intentionally on Euripides' part. And maybe the latter does a better job with the social commentary, or maybe it's just easier to interpret his writing that way from where I'm sitting. There's still a lot to talk about in Oedipus, though, even if we toss out the bits that Freud got all goopy. I was especially fond of this play's treatment of Creon and the clear through lines between this play and Antigone in that respect, which we'll get to in a bit. At number 21 is The Fellowship of the Ring. As I said, alluded to with Children of Húrin, this was a big Tolkien year for me. I revisited what I read as a kid and experienced a lot of his stuff that I hadn't read for the first time. And the fact that Fellowship is only the second entry this high on the list, you should assume he holds up, and by God does he hold up. Tolkien's prose and narrative voice blend to create this really unique experience. I think the prevalence of bad narrator info dumps in fantasy can be traced back to people just failing to understand how Tolkien does it so seamlessly. His narrator is a character too. The narrator is telling you a story with style and flair and a personality all his own, and when he goes on a little digression, it's adding to that ambiance. It's a personality quirk. Those digressions aren't there to clarify information that could have been delivered more naturally. They're just things the narrator wants you to know, even if they don't matter to the plot at all. It's helped by the fact that Tolkien's prose is consistently fantastic, his dialogue is brilliant, and his storytelling is masterful as ever. Every imitator suffers by comparison, and he has more than a few imitators. Number 20 is The Aeneid by Virgil, translated by John Dryden. This was my first full read of the Aeneid, and I chose the Dryden translation, which broke a personal rule whereby I try to stick to prose translations for my first read of an epic, but the Aeneid was a story I was familiar with going in, and the Dryden translation was great. The story itself is almost literally timeless, characters are depicted brilliantly. I mean, it's the Aeneid. I feel like I almost don't need to justify this one. If anything, you probably think it's too low, and who knows, maybe I do too. I think there is a lot of depth in this play to be... It's not a play, it's an epic poem, come on. In this poem to be mined, and I certainly plan on reading it again, but I also am learning Latin, so maybe if I read it in the original Latin, it'll jump even higher on the list, who knows. Number 19 is The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman. This does everything the first book does, but better. It's the most ambitious book in the trilogy, brilliantly expanding its universe, introducing new characters and essential dynamics within a fast and consistently engaging plot. And engaging really is the word I would use for this book, more than any other on this list almost. It is almost impossible to put down. It is fascinating. It's this, you think that you've gotten some really interesting commentary and this really interesting expansion of the universe in the Golden Compass, and then The Subtle Knife just blows that out of the water. It's just really fantastic, and I think that in terms of the actual writing on a sentence-by-sentence level, it might be the strongest book in the series as well, although obviously they're all pretty close in that regard. Number 18 is Homefire by Camilla Shamsi, which might move even higher on this list as I get more distance from it. Shamsi's prose was fantastic, and her reception of Antigone both added to and interacted brilliantly with the original text. I'm working on another video about that, so I won't say too much here, but Homefire was great and you should read it, but only after you've read Antigone, because having that background enhances the read of this book. And it really, I think, is meant to be read that way. Number 17 is The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. I was tempted to rank all of Lord of the Rings as the one book that it really is, but I read each entry a few weeks apart and had slightly different thoughts on each, and so I thought it would be more interesting to talk about that differentiation as well. I actually really liked the slow start to Fellowship that most people penalize it for, but I still put Return barely above it because of its incredible character growth and personal tragedy, as well as the more incisive delivery of the series' anti-war message. They're all really close together, though, and Two Towers is going to be, you'll see it soon. Number 16 is The Epic of Gilgamesh. I forgot who translated the version I read, and I got it from the library, so I can't check. But this is the second book with no attributable author on this list, and it's brilliant. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are the original fictional bromance, and, well, as far as we're concerned today, anything The Epic of Gilgamesh does, it was the first to do. I'm given to understand a new tablet was discovered like weeks before I'm writing this, so I guess I haven't actually read the entire thing, but chicanery aside, there's a reason this story has been preserved in some form or another for so many thousands of years, longer than literally any other. And that age and that the study that's been devoted to it, I think, means that there are just so many great translations out there too. So even though I can't recommend the one I read because I don't know who the hell did it, it's probably hard to go wrong. Just look it up. You'll find something good. Number 15 is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is an expert depiction of unlikable people, with its cast made up almost entirely of the most unpleasant, self-centered characters, each of whom is really easy to become deeply invested in. It also wonderfully blends its magical whimsy with this grim reimagining of the Napoleonic Wars. It's really impossible not to like. I think Clarke has this imagination that creates magic and can use magic to do things both, fascinating, sort of uplifting, and simultaneously really grim and depressing. She's, I suppose she's not unique in the genre, but she's really great. Number 14 is Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb. This is the penultimate Realm of the Elderlings entry on this list, and it finds itself above Fool's Errand for its brilliant capitalization on Golden Fool's expansion of the world. A lot of Fool in that. It progresses and resolves each new conflict Golden Fool introduced brilliantly. Hobb's characters, the engine behind the series, shine brightest here as well, at least so far, as she builds on numerous compelling relationships and conflicts established throughout the previous books. Many have said that this could have been the series' ending, and were it not for the last Hobb book on this list, I might agree. It certainly does wrap up both its own trilogy and everything in Realm of the Elderlings up to that point nicely. I guess not everything, but many things. And it is just a really satisfying ending, something that Hobb is exceptional at, and we've talked about that in basically every Hobb book, that she ends her trilogies and she ends the series fantastically, whatever complaints I might have about how we got there, right? Number 13 is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is a book I want really badly to make a video about, and I might at some point. I see this strange split of people either criticizing the book for or fetishizing the lives of its cast of repugnant narcissists. Those loathsome creatures central to the story are so well written that people seem to forget they aren't supposed to like them, or miss the fact that they aren't supposed to like them. Tartt's critique of old money pretension is made all the more thrilling as you watch this anxiety-fueled nightmare of their lives falling apart around them during the second half of the book. It's a really tightly constructed story, and their paranoia turning them on each other is really fun to watch. This might seem like I'm spoiling things, but it's really, it's all talked about in the first chapter. You know where things are going. It's just a matter of how we get there. When I finished this book, I was sure it would end up at the top 10 come year's end, but there have been some really strong showings since then. First of which is number 12, Antigone by Sophocles, translated by Elizabeth Wyckoff, Seamus Heaney, Anne Carson, and an author named Fritz, whose first name I don't remember. Those were the few that I read, and I'd say Carson was my favorite, so we'll give it to her. Antigone is not just my favorite Greek tragedy, it's probably just my favorite play. The incredible depth in every minute interaction is almost unbelievable. The complexity of Antigone as Menes' relationship, the guard's fear of Creon heralding his tyranny, Creon's subtle conflict with religion and spirituality. Antigone has been used to talk about gender, family, power, colonialism, religion, and so much more, all thanks to the staggering depth of the characterization present in Sophocles' original work. If anything could ever get me to learn ancient Greek, well, I won't say that just yet. We'll see. Number 11, The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, is the best part of Lord of the Rings by a narrow margin for me. It does everything Fellowship and Return do well: the charismatic narrator, engaging dialogue, and surprising dry wit, not to mention some of the greatest storytelling and world building in the fantasy genre. I give Two Towers the edge because it adds to its anti-war message a layer of anti-industrial thinking with the retaking of Isengard. That being the only difference should demonstrate just how tightly packed everything up here is at the top of the list. Number 10 is The Odyssey by Homer, and this time I read the Emily Wilson translation for my second read. This is probably my second favorite ancient epic, resplendent with beautiful imagery and harrowing stories for Odysseus and Telemachus alike. Everything people seem to know about the Odyssey, and by people I do mean myself prior to reading it, comes from the Travels, 4 or so books in the middle of a 24-book epic, and while fantasy readers will probably appreciate the Travels most, that's where Odysseus is really dealing with monsters. That's the Charybdis and Scylla part, that's all of that, that's his journey to the underworld. There's a lot to appreciate outside of the Travels as well. There's some fantastic character work and commentary on Greek and more generally human society, war, sexism, economic stratification. This was my second time reading, like I said, and I'd previously read the Lombardo translation, but I would recommend actually starting with Wilson if you haven't read the Odyssey before. It's a really accessible translation. It's very easy to read, and it's more realistic with its language as well about the realities of slavery in Homeric Greece in particular. That clarity makes poetic translations more accessible later on, and if you have a full understanding of the story, you can, go in and not worry about figuring out what's going on, so you already know, and you can appreciate the poetry a little bit more. Of course, that would maybe be even nicer if I could read ancient Greek, but, whatever. Number 9 is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I do rank above Lord of the Rings. It's just such a delightful and endlessly memorable story. Its commentary on friendship and greed and the magnificence of everyday people is just as poignant reading it as an adult as it was on my first time, dozen reads when I was 9. I only appreciate his prose and humor more on this most recent read, and I felt the episodic structure with a broader plot through line really served this story and is something I wish more authors would commit to. Number 8 is The Iliad by Homer, translated by Stanley Lombardo. The Iliad is my favorite ancient epic, and it's referenced in a hopefully upcoming video. I don't know how long it'll take me to get that out. It barely beats out the Odyssey for me because the Trojan War itself and its attention to Achilles' rage beat out the events that followed that war. I love this poem, even though I wasn't the hugest fan of Lombardo's translation. The underlying story never fails to do it for me. The two things that upset me more than anything else in the world are Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the idea that we lost the rest of the epic cycle, depriving our modern age of countless other great stories from the Trojan War and before. But it's also hard to believe that any of them could have matched this. Homer's contradictory ability to depict this awe-inspiring violence in the process of critiquing it will never not drive me insane. Number 7 is Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James. Finally, his crowning achievement, assuming The Book of Night Women isn't better. I haven't read it. I'll get to it eventually. But James creates this vibrant and fresh world heavily based on Central African mythology, and he makes liberal use of the elements of that mythology. The result is this really surprising from an author with no previous fantasy writing professionally. It's one of the most unabashedly and overtly strange and fantastical books I've read all year. It's a semi-episodic journey through this world, encountering monsters and witches and demigods, along with some of the most interesting, pitiable, and morally complex characters imaginable. James's writing really does demand attention and understanding and empathy, but despite all of that, he only reframes the entire conflict so beautifully in the sequel. Still, the first book of the trilogy stands head and shoulders on top of his bibliography so far for the reasons that I brought up in my discussion of Moonwitch Spider King. I really can't wait for the third book in this trilogy, though. Number 6 is There by Tommy Orange. This is a story about sort of what it means to be a Native American in the 21st century and specifically living in a city. And it really consistently blew my mind with its ability to craft identities for a large cast of point of view characters, each in such little time and each with such incredible voice. The plot folds in on itself, coming together really brilliantly in this harrowing final sequence. The story's ability to create both illuminating dialogue and narrative voice with each character combined with this massive cast gave it a really unique feeling, unlike anything else on this list. Orange's commentary provides a really incisive critique of countless Native American stereotypes while drawing an alternative picture of what it means to be an indigenous person living in the Americas today, and specifically the United States. Number 5 is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I read days before starting Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, so that makes 2 books with a heavy focus on Northern English butlers close to the top of my list, both named Stevens, too, or Stephen, maybe one of them. Yeah, Stephen Black is the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell butler. But anyway, Stephen's story in The Remains of the Day is perhaps the greatest midlife crisis I've ever read, and Ishiguro's writing frames it gorgeously. If you're looking for an external plot, you'll be disappointed, but the story of his journey of self-discovery here, taking place almost entirely through flashbacks and internal monologue and a brief trip to the countryside, is astonishingly compelling. Number 4 is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This is as good as they say. That's what it is. It's complex, it's thought-provoking, it's hilarious, it's about the American identity, it's about understanding life, and it's obviously about killing whales. This is easily the most beautifully written book on this list, with multidimensional humor to accompany commentary on identity, growing up, nature, and everything. Really everything. I don't even feel equipped to talk about Moby Dick. I feel like I should just read it another 20 times, and then I still won't be able to really wrap my head around it. It's just unbelievably complicated and unbelievably beautiful. Number 3 is The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. This did more than just scratch the mythology-loving itch for me. Tolkien's meticulously crafted mythos presented through his incredible writing is possibly my favorite to experience, going up against the likes of the Theogony and the Metamorphoses. Obviously, those are more interesting from an anthropological perspective, but it's not really why I'm interested in mythology personally. Tolkien's storytelling and command of language are just brilliant and lend themselves even more towards this more pulled back grand scale story than his close-up epics, which are still amazing, like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That, combined with my personal weakness for that more pulled back style of writing, makes The Silmarillion my favorite Tolkien book. It just inspires awe in a way that almost no other fantasy can. Number 2 is Fool's Assassin by Robin Hobb. This is her crowning achievement. It is a perfect first novel in the final trilogy, following a perfectly executed time skip. It introduces the best new character the series has seen since Royal Assassin 12 books earlier. It is a beautiful slow burn, brilliantly paced through its developing conflict, and it revisits so many of the motifs of Fitz's childhood through a fresh new lens as he takes on the side of the parent. A professor of mine recently pointed out that while we have an abundance of father-son and mother-daughter narratives, there's a real relative lack of father-daughter narratives, which I think makes this book feel a bit fresher, because he's clearly correct. It would be the best book I read all year were it not for the book I read a week later. Number 1 is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This is the cleverest satire of bureaucracy, the military, and capitalism that I have ever read. It's really the most incisive satire of anything I have ever read. Heller's ability to create a Matryoshka doll of confusing, paradoxical situations, to twist a simple reality into something grotesque and incomprehensible, is such a perfect match for a critique of a bureaucracy that does just that. He pushes everything past the realm of believability, but when you look back, you realize you have no idea where that line was, and realize it might be a lot closer to where you are than you'd like to think. His characters are believable in their absurdity, but I found myself latching onto their experiences above the characters themselves, almost as if I was afraid to get too attached to any of them. And I think that really just further reflects Heller's ability to create these really absurd and really fascinating situations. It's something to behold. Well, that's the list. That's all 111 fiction books that I read in 2022. There were, a couple nonfiction. I don't like comparing nonfiction and fiction. But that's it. And, if you made it to the end, thanks for watching. If you didn't make it to the end, thanks for watching anyway. Yeah, I think that's it. I'm going to try to do another one of these next year. I doubt I'll have as many books to rank next year, but, maybe. I had a lot of free time at the start of the year, or I guess not a lot of free time, but I basically had a situation where all I was doing was school, minimal social obligations, and reading a lot. And I think I have more social obligations and just like other hobbies getting in the way at the start of this year, which isn't a bad thing. I'm happy about it, but it does mean I'm going to read less. Anything else to ramble about before I cut this off? I guess this is my first time with my face out in a video, which is a little uncomfortable, but I had the OBS window hidden for the entire recording session, so I didn't have to look at my face, which is good. Now I have to look at it while I edit, which I'm not really looking forward to. But I got the pop filter hiding it a little bit, which is nice. Anyway, that's the video. I appreciate you watching, and I hope that you will drop me a little like. And actually, yeah, you know what? If you have any thoughts on the list, if you have anything, if you've read books on this list that you want to comment on my placement, please do. If you, also just maybe let me know your favorite book from the year, because I'm sure a lot of people read a bunch of stuff that I didn't get to, and I'd, love to get some recommendations to put on the 2023 list. So yeah, thanks. Bye. Number 31 is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which is just fantastic. Jane's voice is incredible and surrounded by a beautiful writing as she makes her way through this. Fuck. We're back. We're back after some roommate thumping and toilet flushing. It's not their fault, you gotta go to the bathroom when you gotta go to the bathroom, but I'm not gonna record the sounds. There is a lot more, let's just start here again. Number 98, Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb. There is a lot more Robin Hobb to come. Please. There is a lot more Robin Hobb to come, mostly higher or much higher on this list, but for now we arrive at the... idea. We're back after some thumping and some background noise. And it starts again immediately. Why? Why is it like this? Please. Okay. So, number 98, Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb. There is a lot more Robin Hobb to come, mostly